Of course, this time around, it's not the Rose Bowl, it's the Cotton Bowl. The Ohio State Buckeyes facing off with USC, a couple teams that just missed the college football playoff. We're joined by Steve Hellwagon. You can join him on bucknuts.com, also doing work for 24/7 Sports. Steve, how you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing great, Mark. What's going on?
Not too much. I can't wait for these huge matchups, and not just the college football playoffs, but the rest of them. And this is front and center for me, along with a couple other matchups. So before we get started on Cotton Bowl prep, your thoughts about the college football playoff, maybe taking some attention away from the other bowl games. We've got some huge matchups, including this one front and center. The Big Ten championship maybe be tarnished to a certain extent because of the lack of entry into a playoff. Do you think the playoff has hurt as much as it's helped?
Well, we went through the BCS cycle from 98 up and through 2013, whatever that was, 12 years or 15 years, whatever that was. And it was always just two teams that made it. And there were a lot of times people thought, man, that team that finished third or that team that finished fourth. There was one time they had three unbeaten major conference teams, and I think Auburn was the one that got left out. So everyone knows that what's better than two is to go to four. And now they've gone to four. This is the fourth year of this format. And of course, Ohio State was in it the first year and won it. They were not in it the second year. They had a great team, basically the same team coming back, and didn't make it to the Final Four, lost a home game to Michigan State. Last year, they lose to Penn State, who wins the Big Ten, and Ohio State gets in and gets blown out by Clemson. So I think you had three teams this year that were locks. When you talk about Georgia, Clemson, Oklahoma, there was no question that those three, had they won their conference championship games, was going to be in it. It comes down to then Alabama or Ohio State. I think if you looked at it on paper, the resumes were almost identical. I mean, Ohio State had 3 wins against teams ranked better than anybody Alabama defeated in the course of the season. But Ohio State had that 31-point loss at Iowa, and that ultimately seems to be what kept them out of this. I made the comment before the Big Ten championship game that Ohio State didn't need to beat them 59-0 as they did 3 years ago to jump over Baylor and TCU and into the playoff. But they couldn't go out and win the game 17-14 with 3 turnovers, and ultimately that's kind of how it played out. They turned the ball over several times and kept Wisconsin in the game, and it was a decisive win. They were the better team on the field. They just didn't look like a dominant team on the field, and that kind of opened the door, I think, for Alabama. And of course, Nick Saban, he started posturing right away. If we lost by 31 points, you wouldn't hear a peep out of us. So that's what it is. I'm forgetting the best 4 teams in there. I think you could have made a case either way in this instance. And in this instance, it's too bad it's not an 8-team playoff because, quite honestly, Wisconsin, even Auburn with 3 losses, 2 of them over 2 of the top 4 teams, 2 wins over the top 4 teams, deserves, maybe a shot with 3 losses. I mean, there's so many teams out there that you could make a case for, but long and short of it, I look at it that, the Pac-12 in particular has really been shaded under this format. They got Oregon in the first year and Washington in the third year, and that's been about it for them. So I don't know. I don't think any one league can say anything one way or the other than, the Big Ten had a 12-win team, an 11-win team, and a 10-win team and didn't get anybody in. I mean, here's Penn State 10-2, 2 losses by 4 points. I mean, that's just, a crazy scenario for them, kind of like what Michigan had last year, and they don't get in either. So I don't know what to say other than, you play out the season, and I'm not eager for it to go to 8 teams anytime soon. But again, I guess the moral of this story is don't lose by 31 points to a team that only wins 7 games.
It was by far the most magnified football game of the season. Anybody who roughly follows college football had that score ingrained into their head by the end of the process and the selection. Everybody knew Ohio State got blown out by Iowa, and a lot of other commentators couldn't really go to any other games, but that seemed to be the one that magnified more than any other game. And to your point, the Big 12, 2 out of 4, the Pac-12, 2 out of 4 in these 4 playoff years, and the SEC, just 4 years into it now, already has 5 teams out of the 4 years and 5-2 against the Pac-12 and the Big 12. So we already have a great disparity just 4 years into this. I won't go on my rant about the way I think the playoff team should have been selected. My viewers have told me a number of times that they've heard me rant enough about it already. So we'll move on to the Cotton Bowl and Ohio State's motivation for USC. That gets questioned every time a team that has huge aspirations falls a little bit short and gets slotted down. In this case, Urban Meyer has a good track record, most notably and most recently, the team that you just mentioned, the ultra-talented 2015 team that was able to get off the mat and dust off Michigan and dominate Notre Dame in the Fiesta Bowl. So do you have any concerns about Ohio State following in that path?
Well, I think it cuts both ways. You go back to 2013, they lost to Michigan State in the Big Ten championship game and then went and played Taj Boyd and Clemson down in the Orange Bowl and didn't play particularly well. Their defense gave up 41 points in that game, and they get beat. I think it kind of cuts both ways. But my feeling is that this Ohio State team does want to end on a high note. They had several of the players graduated this past weekend in the commencement exercises for fall semester, and they put out a stat. This is a crazy statistic. Of the 22 players who are going to start or figure to start for Ohio State in this game against USC, 11 of them have their degrees. So, they've done everything that they were supposed to do off the field. They've been part of one of the great 4-year runs in Ohio State history with 2 Big Ten championships and the national championship. And I think that they want to go out on a high note. It is a top-notch opponent with USC, the Pac-12 champion, easily the best team in the Pac-12 this year, no question about it. And I think that Buckeye fans are eager to see how the Buckeyes match up against a great Pac-12 opponent. And at the same time, I think the players and the coaches obviously want to end this season on a high note, get to 12 wins, and start the build, the reload, I would say, probably for what could be a great year in 2018.
We're talking Ohio State football with Steve Hellwagon. You can join him on 247 Sports and also bucknuts.com, breaking down the Cotton Bowl against USC, a game in which there will be athletes all over the field. And Steve, I want to draw attention to the running back position because although we see the 2 quarterbacks featured on all the ABC and ESPN promos, Barrett and Darnold, those are the guys that get the headlines and are promoted out front and center. I think this might be the best running back matchup of the bowl season with J.K. Dobbins, of course, having a sensational freshman campaign. And I've long since thought Ronald Jones was maybe a bit underrated, but one of the more explosive and talented backs in all of college football.
I agree. Ronald Jones, what I've seen of him, he's durable. He just churns and churns out the yardage. He had nearly 1,500 yards for USC. And a lot of people think, well, it's a great passing offense. Really, I think in college football in particular, one feeds off of the other. If you can throw the ball, that's going to be able to help your ability to run it. And obviously Ohio State, that's their bread and butter is the power running game out of the spread formation. They run the zone read out of the spread formation with a single back most times. And J.T. Barrett makes a read and either gives it to the running back or keeps it himself. Barrett is quite an effective runner in and of himself, and he usually gets 10 to 15 carries a game. For Ohio State, you're talking about J.K. Dobbins, the true freshman. Very interesting story from LaGrange, Texas. Last year, he was a highly rated recruit. He only played a few plays in the very first game of his senior season in high school before he suffered a knee injury and was out for the rest of the season. He enrolled at Ohio State, participated in some spring drills, and nobody really believed he was going to be the starter for Ohio State with Mike Weber coming back. But Mike Weber had a hamstring injury that really didn't get completely healed till about 2/3 through the season. So Dobbins started all 13 games and has set an Ohio State freshman rushing record with right around 1,300 yards for the year, and just done a bang-up job. I mean, he's put himself as a freshman alongside Mike Weber, who was a 1,000-yard rusher last year as a redshirt freshman, and two other true freshmen, the Maurice Clarett, who went over the 1,000-yard mark. They're the only ones in Ohio State's history. Archie Griffin played as a freshman but didn't get 1,000 yards back in '72. So that'll tell you the kind of company Dobbins has put himself in. And I think he's only scratching the surface of what he can do. I mean, if you watch the Big Ten championship game, he pulls away on two long runs and gets tracked down from behind inside the 10-yard line both times. But he is going to be an electrifying threat for the Buckeyes for the next couple of seasons, it would seem.
We're glad to be joined by Steve Hellwagon. You can join him on Bucknuts and also 247 Sports, talking Ohio State football with the Buckeyes lining up against USC. Losers of 7 straight in this series. Of course, most of us remember this as a huge Rose Bowl matchup a number of times.
I was a little guy the last time Ohio State won this game.
Yeah, I tell you.
And I'm pushing 50.
Of course, the last time out, Steve, was the Matt Barkley comeback, going about 90 yards against that Ohio State defense at the Shoe. And the year before was the first time we saw Terrell Pryor on the field in relief of Todd Beckman in a blowout at the Coliseum. What do you remember about those games?
Well, I've actually been around long enough to have attended the last 2 home and homes. I was a student at Ohio State in 1989. They went out to USC and they lost 42-3. Todd Marinovich was the quarterback then for USC, and then the following year, 90, USC came to Ohio State, and it was a tremendous thunderstorm hit the stadium, and they called the game off. It was a 9-point margin with 2.5 minutes to go. Ohio State failed to recover an onside kick, and John Cooper told Larry Smith and the officials at the time, hey, there's no point to play this last 2.5 minutes out, because all USC was going to do was take a snap and I mean, they had a 2-score lead. So a lot of people have kind of held that against John Cooper, that he gave up the game. If that game had been played today, Mark, they would have stopped it at the beginning of the 4th quarter because there was lightning everywhere. This is as recent as 1990. They played straight through a severe thunderstorm. And until, they had the brains or whatever to finally stop it. They ran into a buzzsaw in 2008 out at the Coliseum. USC was #1 in the country. I believe Sanchez was the quarterback for his senior year. Ray Malaluga, Cushing. I mean, all those guys who've been playing in the NFL now for a few years were on that USC team. And I believe Pete Carroll was still the coach at that point. And they blistered Ohio State 35-3. They came back to Columbus the next year with Barkley, as you mentioned, and it was something like an 18-15 game. Ohio State just couldn't get anything generated, and Barkley led USC down in the last drive of the game to win it. So, Ohio State really does owe USC. Those are the last 4, and then the 3 meetings prior to that would have all been Rose Bowls. I want to say, obviously 84 season, the 79 season, USC denied Ohio State the national championship with Earl Bruce and Arch Leister, Earl Bruce in his first year. And there's one more Rose Bowl since Ohio State won the one on January 1st of 74. So it is the Buckeyes has some payback in mind, I guess, and we'll see how that goes. Urban Meyer was on the staff in 84, I believe, for that Rose Bowl. I believe he may have been on the OSU staff at that point as a grad assistant.
Ohio State football fans, if you're not quite as old as Steve and I, you need to dig into your history a little bit, because it's an illustrious series between Ohio State, USC, and as Steve outlines, most of those games in the Rose Bowl. Chris Carter was so fabulous in that 84 season, New Year's Day 85 game, that although the Buckeyes lost, I believe he was the MVP of that game. Keith Byers ripped off a big 50-yard run early in the game, but did little else in that one.
Yeah, no doubt. Chris Carter, I want to say he set some Rose Bowl records that day. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but somewhere around 8 or 10 catches and well over 100 yards and a touchdown. Mike Tomczak was the quarterback. Keith Byers was the running back. The defense, Eric Kumro would have been playing. And, of course, his nephews, Joey Bosa and Nick Bosa, have been stars for the Buckeyes now. Chris Spielman, Pepper Johnson, William White. I mean, so many guys who went on and played for years and years in the National Football League on both sides of the ball, and just kind of an exciting time it was for Ohio State fans to have won the Big Ten championship that season. They beat Michigan that year with Coach Earl Bruce, and went on to the Rose Bowl. Unfortunately, weren't able to pull out the win, but certainly, I think about as a kid, as somebody growing up, it was always the Big Ten versus the Pac-10 on January 1st in the Rose Bowl until we got to 98 with the Bowl Championship Series. And at that point, things started to take a turn. Some years the Rose Bowl would host the national championship and it would preempt that Big Ten Pac-12 or Pac-10 matchup, and we've only had it sporadically in recent years. There was a Penn State USC game last year, I believe. So, so we see it now and then, but now it's going to be at the Cotton Bowl instead of the Rose Bowl this time around.
Yeah, good stuff there. I could talk on and on, as I'm sure you could. Steve mentions 3 consecutive matchups in the 70s at the Rose Bowl. Each team blew out the other. There was a game also that USC won by 1 point and going for 2 on a late touchdown pass, 18-17.
Yep.
A lot of great players on the field on both sides. That 1980 game, of course, Anthony Munoz and Paul McDonald and Charles White couldn't be stopped on that final drive. As our
200 yards
sophomore led Ohio State in position to gain a #1 ranking in the 11-0 record, and that close to a national championship, 17-16. All right, Steve. Well, I'll bring it up to the here and now, and I won't drag any other folks out there back decades and decades, but we've got Steve Hellwagon on the line from Bucknuts and 24/7 Sports. And Steve, you started to dive into the running game and JT Barrett's effectiveness there. Also, you mentioned Mike Weber, and I think people kind of discounted him when Dobbins exploded onto the scene. Weber, of course, was hurt, but then he had some fine games this back half of the season, most notably against Michigan State. Getting back to JT, though, he's not going to tear anybody up in the ground game in regards to explosiveness or power. He just knows what to do. He can glide. He does have decent speed. But are you surprised by the criticism that JT Barrett has garnered from a pretty good portion of the Ohio State fan base because of not winning supposedly the big game? Although if you beat Michigan each and every year, hey, for the old timers, that's a huge feather in his cap. But are you a bit surprised that he hasn't been embraced maybe as much as he should be?
I think that's a great question. He has more wins as a starting quarterback than anybody in Ohio State history. He's accounted for more touchdowns, rushing, receiving, passing than anybody in the history of the Big Ten. Thrown for more touchdowns than anybody in the history of Ohio State, most passing yards. He leaves with all the records. I think what people would say is that he put up a lot of numbers in games against teams that couldn't compete with Ohio State. I would say that that's a pretty valid statement to say that he had 5 and 6 touchdowns in some games against lesser opponents, where even by only playing a half or part of the third quarter, he still put up 5 or 6 touchdowns. So I think that there are some people who look at it that way. He had one of his very best games against Michigan State on the road back in 2014, where he accounted for almost 400 yards total offense and 5 touchdowns, and they knocked off Michigan State on their way to the national championship that year. So I think that obviously he gets injured. There are a lot of people who say they wouldn't have beaten Wisconsin, Alabama, and Oregon in succession with JT Barrett had he remained healthy and been the quarterback, because Cardale Jones gave them that added benefit of a guy who could really rifle the football. So I think in a lot of people's minds, 2015 kind of hinged on the Michigan State game when the offense was terrible. 2016 came down, obviously losing at Penn State. That was more of a special teams issue. Don't generate any offense at all against Clemson, 31-0, shut out, first time in 23 years or something to that effect. And so you come into this season and you lose to Oklahoma. He's very ineffective in that game, but he and the team came back. We're on a rampage the rest of the way. The Iowa game outplayed both sides of the ball. He gets scapegoated for throwing a pick six on the first play of the game. People watch the Wisconsin game. He had 2 interceptions, and he also missed 2 guys on deep passes, Terry McLaurin and Johnny Dixon. Nobody within an area code of either guy, and he overthrew them both. And I think people just watching that game, when they don't make the playoff, they just come back and they say, this is why we didn't make it, because we didn't make those plays that we had to make to show that it was an impressive victory. So while he wins games, while he, as one of my friends says, he's the great compiler, I would never say that, because I know how difficult it is to win 85% or whatever his number is. I don't have his number. I think he's like 33 or 35-6, whatever he is. And you got to remember, he split some of the time in those games back in 2015 with Cardale Jones. Cardale was 10-0 as a starter and got yanked.
That's right.
What else do you need to know about Ohio State to know that? But that's just the way it is. As Urban Meyer says, that's life in the big city. So, the point I make, people are resentful about JT Barrett. They've won, I want to say, 48 or 49 games in 4 years. And the point I say is, yeah, the next quarterback, Haskins, Burrow, whoever it may be, they could win 50 games in the next 4 years. They could win 2 national championships. Or maybe they only win 43 games. You don't know. You honestly don't know. The margin for error for all this stuff is this thin. One play either way in a lot of these games. So I say give the man credit. He was there. They won 2 Big Ten championships on his watch. He put them in position to win the national championship. They beat Notre Dame in the one bowl game, and he has a chance to go out. There's one record that is in his reach. He has twice accounted for 45 touchdowns in a season, 2014 and this season. Both years, it was 31-14 that year, and I think it's 30-15 this year, or vice versa. With a running touchdown or a passing touchdown, he will set a Big Ten single-season record with 46, 47, whatever he ends up at, and he'll have the top 2 seasons, obviously, going out of this. But that's a record that's going to be awfully hard for anybody to beat.
We're talking Ohio State football with Steve Hellwagon. You can join him on Bucknuts and 24/7 Sports. I also ask that you join us right here for the best in college football coverage, coast to coast, with the best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the industry like Steve right here. We talk college football each and every day. And you brought up the name Cardale Jones twice in terms of the playoff run of 2014, in terms of the quarterback battle and struggle in 2015, just an amazingly talented team in the NFL draft, and the production in the NFL has proven that out over the last couple of years, but a team that, because of the one sloppy game against Michigan State, didn't get a chance to prove that against the best teams in the country. But getting back to Cardale Jones, you had Michael Thomas, to a lesser degree, Jalen Marshall, of course, Devin Smith, just these enormous deep threats that made huge plays in that championship run. The Ohio State wide receiver core, do you think it's finally getting back? It's been such a disappointment since then. It's looked much better the last 5 or 6 games. Johnny Dixon, Paris Campbell on down the line, getting more like 5 or 6 guys into the mix. But your thoughts about the wide receiver play, because I think that's been one of the big letdowns in this team not grabbing a win in some of these huge games.
I agree. I think that what we found was they struggled with route running. They struggled with getting separation from defensive backs. They struggled with catching the football the last couple of years, probably last year more than any, because it was such a young group. They played Curtis Samuel at what they call the H receiver position, the Percy Harvin position in this Urban Meyer offense, the third wide receiver basically. And he had just a humongous year last year. People remember he scored the winning touchdown out of the backfield against Michigan in the double overtime game, 2-3. So he left after the season was over. And Noah Brown, who was the split end, he also left, and it created kind of a vacuum there for some younger guys to get a chance to play. And a lot of these guys have finally responded. Paris Campbell has been the new H. He's done a good job. KJ Hill's the leading receiver as a sophomore, around 40 or 45 catches for him. I look for him to become a star and a frontline guy next year. He's just very consistent, gets him 5 or 6 catches a game. Austin Mack is a guy who has shown some tremendous ability and made the hard-to-make type catches. Ben Victor is the big Randy Moss guy in the red zone to go up and get the touchdowns. And Johnny Dixon's been a guy who's kind of leaked out behind defenses. And Terry McLaurin got behind the defense against Wisconsin, had an 84-yard touchdown. So those 5 or 6 guys, they each have their own separate niche, their own separate role. And then the tight end Marcus Baugh has also been a tremendous receiver as well. He caught the winning touchdown late against Penn State. So I think you look at those 5 or 6 guys and they just rotate them in, and you never know from one week to the next who's going to go up, who's going to go down. But at the end of the day, usually they are right there. Ohio State has been a complete team. When you talk about of all these teams that were being considered, they were in the top 10 or top 15, both offensively and defensively, and nobody else, even in that top 5 or 6, can really say that. So, I think that speaks a lot to just how deep and how across the board this team really is.
Ohio State has been holding down the #1 recruiting ranking during the offseason for the 2018 signing class. Of course, the different dynamic this time around is that from what I understand and gather, about 75 to 80% of the players across the country for the FBS schools and the Power 5 schools will sign in the early signing period, which culminates on December 20th, just a couple days away. Steve Hellwagon joins us from Bucknuts and 24/7 Sports. Your thoughts about the Ohio State recruiting class? I know that there's been a couple of their top commits that have wavered a little bit in recent days.
Yeah, they go into signing day or this early period with 21 commitments, but I think at least 1 or 2 of them are kind of wavering. You've got Jaden Woodbay, one of their outstanding commitments, a safety from California, St. John Bosco prep school out in Bellflower, California. He's a national top 30 prospect as a safety, and he's kind of up in the air, I think, on what he's going to do. And then you've also got the quarterback, Emory Jones from Georgia, who's been taking some other visits. He visited USC this past weekend. I'm sorry, I'm getting my players confused. He visited Florida this past weekend. Florida State is also in on him, Alabama as well, maybe Georgia. So I think it's people ask me what's the percentage he's going to sign with Ohio State. I think as of right now, less than 50%. And he's been committed for a long time, but he's made no bones about the fact he wanted to take other visits. I think if he watched the Michigan game and saw the way Dwayne Haskins got in there and played in relief of J.T. Barrett, and Haskins is just a redshirt freshman. He's got up to 3 years remaining. Perhaps that's given Emory Jones some pause about coming to Ohio State and watching Haskins play for a year or two. But again, these high-end players they look at the depth chart, but they're not going to be dissuaded entirely by it. So I'm not sure what Emory Jones is thinking. He is, I believe, supposed to announce his intention midday on Wednesday. So we'll keep an eye on those two. Ohio State is also after Jackson Carman, an outstanding offensive lineman from Fairfield, Ohio, just outside Cincinnati. He is one of the nation's top 10 prospects overall in the 24/7 Sports composite. He's the player who just visited USC this past weekend, and we'll see. All indications seem to be that Ohio State's the team to beat, but if they could land him, it'd be a tremendous coup. And this class is #1 right now. Just imagine adding a top 10 player and hanging on to a Woodbay and hanging on to Emory Jones, and maybe adding another player or two down the line. This class has more top 100 players than just about any class I can recall from Ohio State, and really even top 50 players. I mean, they have scoured the country. They got guys from 12 states. They only have 3 or 4 guys from the state of Ohio, though, which is probably going to be an all-time record low number of scholarship signees from the state of Ohio for Ohio State. So that's kind of interesting that Urban Meyer truly is going nationwide with his recruiting.
And I know Urban Meyer in the past has spoke to that. Of course, he doesn't want to answer the question head on, but keeping the Ohio high school football coaches happy and keeping a certain element of Ohio happy and keeping the best players there, but not limiting himself, because he wants a national program, national championships. That's where he's aiming, is, of course, to get in the elite. And if Ohio State or Ohio high school football continues to somewhat decline, it's still extremely strong, but not maybe in the top 5 to 6 states in the nation as it was 20 or 30 years ago, then it's going to be difficult for him to maintain that. I would think that he would want the top 5 or 6 players out of the state of Ohio and then go elsewhere for the top end talent as well.
Yeah, if they get Carmen, and another one is Tyreek Smith, a big-time defensive end. He's in the top 70 nationally from Cleveland Heights on the other end of the state. If they get those 2 players, they will have taken the top 5 players in Ohio this year, which is what you set out to do every year. What I would say about anybody who complains about, not enough Ohio talent, I am a big believer that it is important to get kids who are invested in Ohio State to play at Ohio State. It feels like hired guns a lot of times when you get a Bosa out of Florida, or a Zeke Elliott, or a JT Barrett out of Texas. I just throw names out there and not to question their devotion, because those people have all proven to be great Ohio State football players, very good ambassadors of the school, and so on. So I'm not belittling their contributions or anything, but there is concern. It is provincial, just like it is anywhere else. When you have rich high school football, I mean, there's 700 schools playing football in the state of Ohio, and they do produce 150 Division I players every year. So the flip of that is those high school coaches, a lot of whom are Ohio State fans, would be crabbing if they lost this game to USC with or without Ohio guys. So win games is what I think Urban Meyer's been charged with, and that's what he's going to do.
And that Tyreek Smith sign might be extremely important as well, as I'm understanding Ohio State a bit thin on the defensive front, which is surprising to hear because of obviously the immense, not just talent, but depth on the current roster, but with guys most likely leaving early for the NFL and just the graduation rate and leaving that defensive end, and them losing a few guys up front in the recent news of guys committing elsewhere, that Tyreek Smith suddenly has become, not that he's not a tremendous player, because he is, and actually I interviewed him on here about 6 months ago, that he is an excellent player, but he's become a main target because of the attrition along the defensive front. Yeah,
no question about it. They're losing 2 seniors, Tyquan Lewis and Jalen Holmes, plus Sam Hubbard is more than likely. He got his degree in commencement exercises this past weekend. He is more than likely to jump to the NFL. And so you lose those 3, but you do have Nick Bosa back for his junior year. Also, Jonathan Cooper will return. There is one more guy in this rotation. The freshman, Chase Young. He did a nice job this year. He was a big-time recruit for 2017. And they're probably talking about moving Draymond Jones, who's been a defensive tackle, back out to end next year. I think that's a position he could play. He's got the athletic ability. They had a recruit by the name of Brenton Cox, a national top 100 guy, who had committed but then decommitted. I'm not sure if there's any chance that he would get back into the fold at the 11th hour, either this signing day or in February. That ship may have sailed, but they have definitely made a concerted effort to get in on some of the top defensive linemen. And with Tyreek Smith from Cleveland Heights, Ohio, I know Penn State has been in on him. It may be a battle between those 2 and USC for Ohio State for Smith and to add him this class.
Steve Hellwagon joining us to talk Ohio State football. Check out his work at 247 Sports and also Bucknuts. Steve, we appreciate the insight, the information, and you stopping by for the first time, and hopefully you'll be back sometime soon.
Yep, anytime, Mark. Love to do it.